Results of last week's election. Speaking at a rare campaign-style rally in Minsk, Lukashenko called on his supporters to defend their country, but they were soon outnumbered by the largest anti-government demonstration in the nation's history. Now the president is reaching out to Russia for support. Euronews international correspondent Annalise Borges sent this report from Minsk.
United in one voice.
Fighting for freedom.
Tens of thousands of Belarusians marched across Minsk to demand a new country.
We would like our country to be free. We would like to have free and honest elections. We would like to have a freedom like we see in other European countries. And we don't see it right now with our existing president.
The regime of Alexander Lukashenko is facing its gravest crisis in 26 years. Earlier on Sunday, the man himself appeared in front of a few hundred of his supporters for the first time since the unrest started, to deliver a somber warning.
If you lose your first president, it will be the beginning of your end.
In the streets of Minsk on Sunday, Lukashenko's supporters were vastly outnumbered by those who want him out and who defied authorities marching towards the same rallying spot.
What is happening right now was unthinkable until a very short time ago. Thousands of people taking to the main avenue here in Minsk and marching right in front of the headquarters of the secret police, the KGB.
Demonstrators demanded the release of political prisoners and an end to the brutal force used by police against protesters.
We say hands off our kids, our loved ones, our citizens. We want all those responsible for what happened to be charged in court.
At least 2 people were killed in the unrest that followed last Sunday's presidential election. 2 people, too many, according to these protesters.
There isn't a family that hasn't been affected by this tragedy. There was a lot of blood, there was torture in detention centers. You can see the result. People are here. Long live Belarus!
It is virtually impossible to predict what will happen to Belarus. The rival crowds in Independence Square on Sunday suggest there still are competing views for what the future should bring. The question now is, will those who cast their ballots last week finally get their voices heard? Annalise Borges in Minsk, Euronews.
Well, Katsiarina Shamsina is a political analyst at the Belarusian Institute for Strategic Studies. She says Russian support for Lukashenko will only go so far.
So I think that Russia is closely watching the developments in Belarus, particularly because it's one of the core interests for Russia in the region to keep Belarus close in its orbit as much as possible. And but at the same time, when Lukashenko turned to Putin for support, threatening that the current unrest can even bring some Russian military involvement in Belarus. This is just pure rhetoric, and it sounds that Lukashenko is trying to scare his opponents domestically and trying to scare the West from supporting the current opposition, who is gaining momentum. I think that for Russia, it is very unlikely to involve again in the military actions or any other brutal interference, because this would simply hurt Russia's image internationally. And Russia already has quite enough leverage over Belarus in terms of economic dependence and political dependence. And I would assume that they would further use some, let's say, legal means, such as proceeding with union-state integration or other more covert techniques to keep Belarus in its orbit.
Now, we've seen those huge demonstrations against Lukashenko yesterday all over the country, only a relatively small number coming out in support of the president. You were in Minsk last week, I believe. How would you describe the mood in the country at the moment?
So the moods are unprecedented. We have never seen those crowds in, I would say, at least 3 decades of Belarusian history. And this uprising is happening at the background of very brutal repressions where people were tortured in the detention centers after they went to the streets in the past week. And this does not stop. This seems not to stop anymore the protests, even the fear of repressions. And it seems that the Belarusian authorities are now trying to change the tactics. They've released the prisoners, and they allow or seem to allow those massive rallies. And I would also underline that the pro-government protesters were brought on a semi-voluntarily basis, mostly the employees of the state enterprises from the regions, and they were strongly encouraged by the authorities to come. But even then, their numbers were much less impressive compared to the self-organized crowds. Only those crowds we saw from the protesters. They gathered from Minsk only, from the capital. They did not come from the regions.
Now, you say the protests are self-organized. Of course, lots of the opposition leaders have gone into exile. How much of a problem is that for the opposition movement? How long can they carry on like this, being self-organized effectively?
In 2010, 2006, when there were massive protests in Belarus at the elections, there were leaders who were very soon imprisoned and otherwise faced